Zoning Board of East Hampton, you're live on television and being recorded.
Okay, thank you, Michael and LTV. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Town of East Hampton Zoning Board of Appeals meeting for July 27th, 2021. This evening, we have one scheduled public hearing, and then we have a few other items on the agenda that we will be getting to after that. I will read in the first scheduled public hearing for this evening. The applicant is Nigel Curtis, DEIS. The applicant is Nigel Curtis. The lot size and location is 23,848 square feet at 393 Cranberry Hole Road, Applicant, tax map number 300-128-1-28.2. The description: public hearing on a draft environmental impact statement, DEIS, as well as identified deficiencies of the DEIS on Nigel Curtis's application to allow an approximately 185 linear foot GeoCube sandbag revetment and a 5 foot by 10 foot pedestrian walkway extension to remain on a parcel of land containing barrier dunes, beaches, dune land, and beach vegetation. The hearing will be continued on August 10th, 2021 at 6:30 p.m. Such application requires a natural resources special permit pursuant to 255-4-20 and a variance from 255-3-85 coastal erosion overlay district regulations and any other relief necessary from the town code to allow a coastal erosion control structure to remain where installation of a new coastal erosion control structure is prohibited. The parcel is located at 393 Cranberry Hole Road, Gansett, New York, tax map number 300-128-1-28.2. Copies of the draft DEIS, as well as the identified deficiencies of such, is available on the Town of East Hampton website, as well as by contacting Kyle Vorpal, the Secretary of the Board, 631-324-8816, kvorpal@ehamptonny.gov. The relief sought here is the relief described above. The zoning district is A residential AE flood zone, elevation 9, and BE flood zone, elevation 12. The secret class is unlisted. And council, do we have a proper affidavit of service?
There is no affidavit of service on this hearing.
Not required.
It was noticed properly by publication in East Hampton Star, and there is no requirement of posting on a public hearing on a accepted EIS for public review. So that's the stage that we're in. So that has all been properly done.
Thank you, council. Maybe you could just, for the public listening, you could give a few comments, council, on this somewhat unique or not the type of hearing we have every week.
Yeah, this is not the typical hearing on an application. There was a positive declaration on this application, and that has started the secret process. And we are at the stage now that the draft EIS was accepted for public review. It was accepted with some noted identified deficiencies, and we are now here for public review and to give the applicant an opportunity to respond on the deficiencies and any additional information that they want to present, as well as to have public comment and comment from our planning department with regards to the substance of the EIS, as well as the deficiencies. Public comment will stay open until we'll have the second half of the hearing, as you noticed, on August 10th, where the public can also continue to make comment, and written public comment can be accepted until August 20th. And at that time, the hearing will close and a final EIS will be prepared by ZBA or its delegates. So.
Okay, thank you, council, for that summary. Appreciate that. Okay, so we will go to the applicant's agent first. Good evening, Andy. You will give us your name and address and all for the record, please.
Sure. Richard A. Hammer, the unknown Hammer, representing Nigel Curtis. Good evening, members of the board. It's been a while since I've been in this actual building, and it feels good to be back here.
It's nice to see you.
I'm sure. I don't want to take too much of the time tonight.
Yeah.
I did submit a written submission. You'll have in your files. I asked you to review it. That written submission, I solicited input from the surveyors, the contractor who installed the geotextiles. Dr. Burns weighed in on it. So I think that's a much more definitive thing.
Mhm.
I had requested the hearing be continued tonight because when we were noticed of it, Tara Burke from my office is on vacation this week and wasn't going to be able to attend. I would appreciate if she has anything to add, she can do that at the continued hearing, but my expectation is hopefully we don't have any need for a continued hearing. Similarly, Nigel Curtis was going to be attending this hearing until he couldn't earlier today. He was forced to leave to attend a fairly urgent medical procedure. His wife is at the house. I think you might have met her earlier.
I stopped by this afternoon.
Yeah, I was told that you had visited. He sends his regrets. He really, really did want to be here tonight. It's the utmost importance to him. However, on the other side of the spectrum, I would love to not be here tonight. I hate these applications. I hate the emotional tone of them. Frankly, it's difficult. It's heart-wrenching and it's complex. I have no desire to fight with Brian or anybody else who has positions on this. But I did make a promise to Nigel when I accepted his original application that I would follow this through to the end. Here I am tonight. I want to briefly touch on some of the significant issues we identified in our resubmission to the board. As Nancy Lynn correctly states, we're here tonight considering this DIS in conformance with the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Put this statute in its clearest terms, it requires municipalities, their boards, people that are governed by the statute, to take a hard look at the potential adverse environmental impacts from proposed actions. It doesn't say that potential for environmental impacts precludes the approval of the project. It requires you to take a hard look by the reviewing agency. And you, as the lead agency on this project, is the Zoning Board of Appeals, must consider these actions, the alternatives, before deciding on a course of action. It's frankly that simple. So the documents, studies, analysis we submitted is what we think constitutes a hard look. We've evaluated the accretion, erosion, literal transport of sediments, and with projections, alternatives, and mitigation measures. We maintain that the existing geocube structure has impacts that can be managed and mitigated by periodic replenishment of the sand that will diminish the potential for adverse environmental impacts. It's a fairly simple solution to a complex problem. However, I think it does bear mentioning some of the more complex inconsistencies we encountered in our review of these documents, as well as the board's deeming of them incomplete. From the outset, I wanted to call your attention to a statement made in the original environmental assessment form. I see this contention frequently. In the document, it says, and I quote, "The property was acquired by the current owner in 2016 when knowledge of the recent erosion history of the property was readily available, and the applicant should provide evidence of any due diligence of the coastal conditions prior to purchase." This is a thinly veiled assertion that Mr. Curtis did something unwise when he purchased this property from the prior owner. I can't speak to what his mindset was when he acquired the property. I didn't get involved with Nigel or this property until 2018. However, I want to emphatically tell you, I don't think it matters whether the current applicant purchased the property yesterday, last week, or it was willed to them by their great-great-grandmother. Everybody who purchases property should have an expectation that their home and their property deserve some form of protection. Length of ownership is frankly irrelevant under our town code and to this analysis. This property has been subjected to erosional forces exacerbated by the hard structures to the east for decades. They've seen observable and quantifiable impacts over these years. These structures, and I'm not saying just the Curtis house, but all adjacent houses are zoned residential, were part of approved residential uses, many of whom were granted permits from the Zoning Board of Appeals to exist, as I discussed in my submission. And at that time, they provided generous setbacks from the wetlands and coastal bluffs, in some cases coupled with scenic easements that were designed to protect the coastal resources from these natural features. Sadly, these easements are no longer in existence. They've been consumed by the erosion. I think it's a little disingenuous said that buyers should be aware Perhaps the ultimate blame resides in the development of this area at all, or the acceptance of applications to build on them. Perhaps the best alternative would have been these should have been acquired by the town many, many years ago, but that's not where we are tonight. I did want to call the board's attention to a report we submitted in our original EIS by Dr. Mark Burns from Applied Coastal. Dr. Burns is a highly respected, qualified, and influential geomorphologist who is very familiar with coastal landforms, erosion, and processes. A direct quote from his report at page 6 says, "The beach fronting primary operations for the fish factory were net erosional between 1845 and 1892 at about 1.4 feet per year. After industrialization of the coast and construction of numerous shore perpendicular structures that block natural west-directed sand transport, the same areas became accretional at 2 foot a year." Basically, they went from an eroding feature to accretion, where they started to grow. This is supported with digitized shorelines, models, and calculations. Basically, this hardened shoreline, groins in the original boat basin, is a driving force creating the erosional issue, the engine that has driven this problem from the onset. By contrast, this engine is somewhat glossed over in the LWRP document that I found on the town website, where it states, "A second disused marina lies at the site of the old fish factory at the Promise. This was at one time a large industrial operation for reducing bunker fish Manhattan to fish meal and fertilizer, but ceased operations in the early 1960s. The site is now New York State Parkland. Deteriorating bulkheads and docks, as well as concrete and brick structures, remain on the site, and some infilling of the old navigational channels is evident. A buried groin, which may actually be the remains of one of the bunker boat holes, lies to the east of the old fish factory basin and acts to deflect the littoral drift slightly. As mentioned above in this coastal exposure, particularly the west side of Cherry Point, is relatively sheltered, and the littoral disruption by these structures is probably minimal." That was the town's conclusion in the LWRP. I think probably minimal is a telling statement. There was no in-depth analysis, qualifying, or demonstration of this, the veracity of this statement. We submitted this analysis with historical patterns of shoreline recession and accretion to the board, with the conclusion by Dr. Burns that is the actual demonstrated cause of the erosion, the disruption of the littoral transport and impoundment of the transport and demonstrated accretion west of the structures, which is very, very far from probably minimal in this instance. One of the incomplete categories listed by the board was the discussion and applicability of and compatibility of the local waterfront revitalization plan. There you have it. The LWRP was probably wrong, but I can go a bit further and say it is almost definitively wrong with respect to characterizing this area of the shoreline and the impacts that would be faced in the future after adoption of the document. It is difficult to be consistent with the LWRP and the regulations that implement it when the document itself is probably not accurate. The regulations that flow from it would be inherently flawed. Last point I want to make, in the proposed notice of completion, the final EAS document, you produced 2 documents that got us to the hearing tonight, which will be the zoning board's document. So this is your document. It's one that you're going to adopt at the conclusion of this procedure. It states, "The property is located on Cranberry Hole Road, which, when combined with Bendigo Road, consists of approximately 7,000 linear feet in the peak-based shoreline that is predominantly free of an erosion control structures." Well, we know that it really isn't true, because the fish factory structures to the east that include the boat basin, groin, and other structures, they're not really erosion control structures, but that's how they're acting right now. They're disrupting littoral flow. I consider that a coastal structure just like anything else. I wanted the board to examine the photo I submitted this morning, and I think it is on it can be put on there. When you look at, when I reduced it and put it in my submission, it kind of loses its muster because it gets more difficult to decipher. But if you look at that picture, it shows 3 erosion control structures right now exposed right in a row. Only one of them is Mr. Curtis's structure. Can we put that picture on the whiteboard or somewhere where it's displayed?
Excuse me, Chair. For Mr. Frank in the room, we have lost your connectivity to the Zoom meeting. If you could rejoin, please.
I'm sorry. I didn't touch it, I swear.
Other than, the properties directly to the east and the west that you refer to in your general analysis,
Yes.
are they legal structures today?
No, they are not.
So then how are they pertinent to your argument?
Because the coastline has been hardened. This board can't just take a look at Mr. Curtis's impacts from his structure alone. This is a coastline.
I look at that, if they're not legal structures, isn't that like, getting caught for speeding and saying, officer, you should let me go because the other cars are going at the same speed as I was? It's like, how does that apply to the Curtis property and what we're looking at tonight specifically?
Okay. Sirota, Curtis,
Golden, right there, 3 in a row.
3 illegal structures today.
That is correct. As far as I know, I didn't follow up on the building permit histories, but they're in the exact same predicament we are. What I'm talking about is equal protection and selective enforcement. Mr. Curtis is the only one of these.
Is not a function of this board. My point is, are we spending too much energy talking about this when we need to be, concentrating on it?
how do you parcel out impacts from this
GeoCube structure.
when these have been in existence for much longer?
I'm not saying enforcement might not be an issue. I'm saying, how does it apply to what we're concentrating on tonight?
Well, the board is, the ultimate standard of the zoning board of appeals is arbitrary, capricious abuse of discretion.
The zoning board can't be arbitrary and capricious if the town, how is the zoning board arbitrary?
Well, you're the one, the zoning board is empowered with the balancing act and saying, hey, listen.
You've already sanctioned the board about being arbitrary and capricious.
Sanction the board?
No, not sanctioned, you know what I'm saying?
I pointed out some inconsistencies in some of the legislation and the factual underpinnings. I just think it would be very difficult to be sitting in your shoes, looking at a shoreline with 3 structures in immediate proximity to this, only one of them which is in front of you tonight. And that is because Mr. Curtis did what he was asked to do. We applied for the emergency permit, then we applied for the natural resource special permit. These other 2 structures are presumably identical, having the same or identical impacts or no impacts whatsoever. But I think it's very hard for you to say, Mr. Curtis, you have to comply. We're going to turn a blind eye to this. And I think it's so striking that it needs to be visualized by the board right now. I also believe that this is indicative of, geez, there's a real problem going on. I happen to know that this property owner right here is also in the process of applying for an emergency permit for a GeoCube revetment. These are not imaginary impacts. These exist on the field, and John was there today walking up and down. It's clear that we have, a coastline that's threatened, particularly threatened on this side of Cranberry Hole Road. As you go farther down and you get closer to the Devon Yacht Club, the properties increase in depth. And that was one of the other considerations is, well, we'd love to do an erosion control district. They have been speaking among all the neighbors, but I haven't found a continuity of interest. Everybody's in a different predicament. These properties are all in the same predicament right now and should be managed. And perhaps this is a time for the town to take a proactive stance rather than a reactive stance.
That's not this board, Andy. That's not this board, I don't believe. And each one of those properties, if you will, signed a building permit and signed an affidavit in filing that building permit that they would follow this town code, which calls for its removal after a certain point of time. So there's an affidavit on file for each one of those property owners. So that's problematic for me.
Okay, well, but the fact of the matter is these structures have been in existence longer than Nigel Curtis's. And
Understood.
so I think this board has to act consistent with the fact that we have more impacts that are affecting this coastline. So to evaluate Nigel Curtis, you're supposed to evaluate the entire coastline. I think it would be legally incorrect for you to say, well, we cannot look at those. In fact, you are. You can see them right there. They're part of assessing whether or not there is a balancing act between what are the projected impacts and what are the intended benefits. These 3 people, the other 2 people, took the position that, well, the intended benefit outweighs my perception of what the detriment is. And that's kind of what the zoning board is supposed to be doing on these applications, is balancing all of these criteria to come up with what we think is an equitable and just answer. That doesn't necessarily answer your question. However, I do think that these, in fact, are relevant to the proceeding in front of us tonight and your assessment of the relative impacts. As I said, it's pretty clear we have an issue along this stretch of coastline. Mr. Curtis is being held to the highest possible review standard, and these other properties haven't had any review. I think this is a fundamental fairness issue. We should all be held to the same standard. In fact, it seems like this would be a really good option for our local government to become proactive, as I mentioned, rather than reactive. To a certain extent, we're all in this together. These people, this coastline, need help, and perhaps the government is the best place to get it, because that is the single unifying thread. We're all in the town of East Hampton. On this same document, the board contends that one of the potential environmental impacts is alternative sustainable solutions to the threat of erosion have not been properly explored. This isn't actually an environmental impact. It's an allegation that our town code requires us to explore certain non-structural soft solutions to the erosion issue. While what this does not acknowledge is that we've tried non-structural natural solutions to this erosion problem. That's why there are no natural dunes in property seaward of the Curtis house. Maybe they've lost 100 feet of upland. That was the soft solution, and it did not withstand the fury of the erosional forces on this. Nourishing this shoreline may offset erosion to the west of the Curtis problem, but it will not solve erosion on this property. This essentially, beach nourishment at a smaller scale is a Band-Aid. We're going to need a real solution that will involve proactive involvement of state and local governments, an erosion district, potential removal of the offending structures that are to the east of us. Once again, that's state park land. Some of that's on town property. I don't think that's an easy solution, but that would certainly solve it. That's something we would love to explore as well. As a matter of fact, I think at the first hearing, I presented a letter from the supervisor to the state parks that said, yeah, we would like you to consider doing that. I am quite certain, as a matter of fact, I bet a bottle of scotch to each of you that nothing has happened. That letter was filed away. But those are the identifiable things that we think would make perfect sense for us to pursue. It's a terrible application review process, and it's a terrible application for everyone involved. It's heart-wrenching, emotionally charged stuff. Please put yourself in Mr. Curtis's shoes, or for that matter, anybody who owns homes on this stretch of beach, whether they purchased a week ago or decades ago, it makes no difference. This isn't just real estate to these folks. This is their home in one of the most beautiful places that we can imagine. It's under attack by forces more powerful than we are. I would ask the board to consider all the information that we've submitted, and please grant the variance and NRSP to allow this fight to continue. I'm not saying that's going to solve it, but this fight must continue until we have a more comprehensive solution, and and in the interim, we'll provide the mitigation that our analysis says we will address, to address the impacts that were identified.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Next, we'll hear from the planning department. Good evening, Brian.
Good evening, board members. Brian Frank, Chief Environmental Analyst. Kind of getting reset up. I keep getting bumped out of the meeting and having to kind of reset up. So
Yes.
Excuse my little bit of dishevelness. Again, Brian Frank on behalf of the planning. I need to grab my notes. But let me start by sharing with you a couple of things I agree with Andy Hammer about. I also hate erosion control applications. They are some of the hardest applications to review. You're not talking about whether somebody can make their house a little bigger or whether they get a pool or not. But these applications have ramifications beyond this property. And that is why the code is set up the way it is. This is recognized in the town code. Erosion control applications don't solve problems. They move problems. They add to the problem. And that's what will happen if this area of shoreline is hardened. We are going through the secret process. The purpose of an environmental impact statement is to take a hard look at identified environmental impacts. We had a hearing on this application back in 2018, I believe it was, July 2018. I hope you review that hearing. And you'll see in the beginning comments, both Andy Hammer and then who was involved in the application, Aaron Tertullian, said the sandbag revetment was not a permanent solution. It was not an answer to the problem. They were asking for an indefinite permit, but were willing to settle for a term limited permit while they explored an erosion control district, and they felt confident that they could not develop one, but implement an erosion control district in 5 years. And that was the time frame that they asked for. The Curtises, I've had the pleasure of meeting them a number of times. They seem like wonderful people. They have never been anything less than warm and gracious any of the times that I've stopped by to monitor the conditions on the property. If permit standards were based on whether people were nice or not nice, these applications would be a lot easier, but they're not. The town code developed specific standards for erosion control structures because of the importance of the town's shoreline to the town as a whole, its identity. And a lot of that is in the EAF that you have in the file. I'm not going to repeat that now. We did that in 2018. But again, the other reason for that is that, again, you harden a property, you don't solve a problem, you move that property to another area. And I think Andy's comments already suggested that, where there's always finger pointing at something that was done frequently before zoning, frequently by private interest. The fish factory was not a town operation. It was not a state of New York operation. It became state parkland, but it was a private business that dates back to the early 1900s. Far in advance of most, if not all, of the homes on Cranberry Hole Road. I can't imagine what the processing of bunker smells like, but I can imagine that when that factory was in full operation, the eastern part of Cranberry Hole Road would be a desirable place for any home, summer home or year-round home. You have to be a fisherman to kind of develop a tolerance to the smell of bunker oil.
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to remember when the wind was out of the east when I was a little kid. In Northwest Woods, you could smell that.
I don't doubt it. The bunker's an oily fish. That's why they make meal out of it. I'm sure it was fragrant.
Yeah.
So again, these applications have ramifications far beyond the limits of the property line. And that's why erosion control applications are frequently referred to as a domino effect. A property experiences erosion. They harden. That starves that depletes the sediment budget. That does result in wave scour, a lowering elevation of the beach. The adjacent property feels compelled to do the same thing, and so on, and so on, and so on, until the resource is completely gone. And that was identified in the LWRP correctly, in my opinion, and reflected in the town code standards. I do want to get into the meat of the impact statement and what I believe are its deficiencies. But I do want to touch on a couple of, one.
Can you just touch on what the town is doing with the two adjacent properties that he brought up in his example? What is the enforcement procedure and that the town has done? Because I think that is important.
Well, I disagree, and let me tell you why. Andy has alleged that Curtis is being held to a different standard and being singled out and arbitrary and capricious, and I'm telling you that the opposite is true. Curtis hasn't been treated any different than any of the other properties around it. The Curtises have elected to go through the permit evaluation process. That evaluation process led to where we are right now. If the other applications go through the permit process and they're treated differently under the same circumstances, I'll leave it to the attorneys to tell you what arbitrary and capricious is. But in my experience, that is the definition of arbitrary and capricious. This application is about the Curtis property. It's not about the Sirota property. It's not about the Golden property. It's not about the fish factory. It's not about downtown Montauk. It's not about the lighthouse or any of the other deflecting references that Andy has made in his most recent submission. The issue for the board is, are there significant environmental impacts from the existing structure? If so, how should they be addressed? This is a very unusual application. Environmental impact statements are designed, as pardon me if I'm repeating myself, but to really focus on identified potential environmental impacts. Because an impact statement can focus as something as individual as a single family zone property and an erosion control structure to a shopping mall or even a nuclear power plant. Scoping is often done to focus the document on the areas of concern. For an application like this, nobody would expect a traffic study. Nobody would expect an energy analysis to analyze what type of fossil fuel consumption would be resulted. Those are legitimate parameters of an environmental impact statement for the appropriate project. The scope that the board adopted for this identified specific information that they asked for to evaluate the impact of this application. And with all due respect to Andy, the submissions, the multiple submissions, have failed both quantitatively and substantively to address those issues. And that's really what we're here to discuss. We did have 2 public workshops on the draft environmental impact statements. There was no participation from the applicant or their representative at either of those meetings. A lot of what Andy submitted to the file last week arguably should have been included in the second draft of the impact statement. It wasn't. I'm going to proceed by addressing what I think are the most relevant deficiencies in first the impact statement and then the submission to the board once, as I have to get the computer back up. Excuse me for 1 second.
Sure.
I have this. I want to remind the board that this application was initially submitted in 2017, and that's why I have photos of the property in April 2017. Another area that I agree with Andy on is there's a serious erosion problem here. I don't think that that any rational person could look at the aerial photos, even going back to 2001. Just from 2001 forward, that's what was in the planning department's analysis. That's what the planning department felt credible in assigning an estimated erosion rate to using aerial photographs. But this was the property in 2017 when the application was just a proposed revetment. There's erosion. You can see that there's vegetation that's on the beach. That was once part of the dune, but there is a dune there. I want to remind the board that this was the subject of a permit that was issued by the DEC and I encourage you to review those permit conditions that had a permit condition, I'm going to paraphrase, that prohibited the excavation of the vegetated dune to install the revetment or seawall, whichever you want to call it. It also required the revetment to maintain continual sand cover. And in the event that it was exposed for more than 30 days, it required its removal. It assigned the date of April as a removal date, which whatever, those were the terms of the permit. That was the permit that this property accepted, and by initiating the project, agreed to. When they submitted the emergency permit to the town building department, they included a removal plan. They told the building department in reading that emergency provision of the town code, yes, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put this in 6 months or 9 months if we get an extension. We're going to remove it and we're going to restore the beach. That has not been done. The sand cover has not been maintained. So when Andy talks about the mitigation going forward, about keeping the revetment covered with sand, there's really a very poor track record for doing that there hasn't been any effort to do that with the existing structure. It has just continually become exposed. I've been there a number of times over the last 2.5+ years. I haven't taken photographs every time I was there, but I have monitored, and I can tell you what has happened with where it has eroded first and how it's become exposed. One of the basic questions that you've asked the applicant in their document is, what has your monitoring been? And it hasn't been answered. And that's frustrating. Some basic questions, not about what you're going to do, but what has been done, haven't been answered here. And it really, it really brings into question the feasibility of what the applicant says that they can do going forward in keeping this, the term is shoreline neutral, allowing this structure to protect the house without it having adverse impacts on the adjoining property. I would respectfully offer that there's no evidence to suggest that they can do that. But if the computer will cooperate, I had mentioned I had mentioned the excavation of the primary dune. I had happened to be, as I mentioned it at the hearing, I have been in the area for other reasons when, doggone it. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
That's right. We understand. We understand.
No, I want to bring up the photos of from January 2018. I won't. A lot of these, I think it's appropriate to add to your written file. Some of them are, but not all of them. But this is the GeoCube seawall under construction, and was the primary dune excavated? Was a vegetated dune removed? The installation of this increased the vulnerability of this property to erosion.
Can you remind us, the previous photo before they did that was 2017 with all the beach vegetation?
Was, if I'm not mistaken, it's April 2017.
And this is January?
This is January, the date is covered up on the screen here, but I believe it's January 26, 2018.
So about 7-8 months later, whatever, something like that.
Correct. Well, they went, again, they had started a process for a natural resources permit, realized that they might have relief in the form of the emergency permit, and pursued that under the terms that I just summarized. I want to bring you to your attention right away in the draft impact statement on page 4, under alternatives considered. The alternatives considered don't match the alternatives that were asked for in the final scope, which included alternative design and technologies, including non-structural restoration efforts to date. We believe that there haven't been any non-structural restoration efforts to date. If I understand Andy's comments correctly, he's saying that the natural dune that was there were the non-structural restoration efforts. That's not what I think we all know that that's not what's meant. That ideally, whether you call it soft restoration, dune reconstruction, that is a prerequisite for an erosion control standard in the town code, and articulating clearly and definitively whether that has occurred or not, or to what extent is relevant to the board making a finding as to whether this is eligible for a permit or not. The applicant has chose not to address that anywhere in the document.
Brian, just change while you have that photo still there, as you know, and the board knows, there is also a third tier of the cubes that is the top of the cubes is at grade,
Well,
So I'm just asking you, when they were installing this, they must have trenched out quite a large ditch in front of these two tiers that we see to install the first tier of cubes, because
the lowest level is below the elevation of the beach. That's reasonable. Again, the plan that was approved is really little more than a sketch. It's not a survey. It wasn't designed by an engineer. It's an illustration basically, and that's not a criticism of the applicants necessary. That's what the DEC approved, and that's what the town approved But another point that that I would raise here, that we ask the applicant, or the board asks the applicant to consider, is what is the full extent of the structure? And the applicant's answer to that was refer to the first coastal sketch in 2016 that was used to approve the permit. And I'm not going to bring it up now because navigating this thing is a little bit clumsier than I'd like to admit, but you're familiar with it and it's in your file. And what it shows is it shows one vertical row of stacked, maybe slightly tiered back sand cubes. Is that what's on the property? It seems from other geocubes that we've seen in town, frequently there are two horizontal rows of them, not one. Is that what's on this property now? Is this part of a return over here? Or is this a second row of cubes that run the length of the project behind the seawardmost row? As an area in the eastern part of the property over here got more exposed, it was pretty clear that was not, I had thought initially that was the lowest row and the two rows above it were stepped back from that. As the beaches continue to lower as a result of wave reflection off of this, that lowest level is exposed now. And it's pretty evident that it's a row in front. So you are reviewing, you're trying to evaluate a structure that you don't even know its accurate composition. You don't know. It was a fairly straightforward question to provide the design of the structure, and the applicant has declined to provide that in the impact statement. Under removal plan, you know, they've told you in the impact statement that there is no removal plan. That's different in the July 21st submission from Andy. But the body of the impact statement says, yeah, we're not removing. You said we were maybe looking at 5 years. But again, at that hearing, both Andy Hammer and Aram Turchinian told you that these geocubes were not a permanent solution. Now there's a vague reference to repairing or replacing them as they age or deteriorating, and that level of detail is really not sufficient. This was a fairly invasive process. When you take a look at the overhead aerial that you have in your file from 2018, they took a heavy piece of machinery from the street along the eastern property boundary, kind of punched through to the shoreline there and used that for construction access. I believe for both the Curtis property and the Sorota property to the east, which was rebuilt at the time. Those photos I have from 2017. If you want, I can show you the photos of the Sorota revetment at the time. The sandbags were sagging, collapsing. Oh, goodness.
Perhaps the Golden property was the same access as well.
Golden, I didn't even know about it at the public hearing that you had in 2018. I presume that Aram did, because I was probably the agent for that. I didn't look at the permit of that. I don't want to say that Andy knew about it, but I didn't know about that. I didn't even know that structure was on the beach until it became exposed earlier this year. And again, we're really here to talk about the. I got to put all the way in. The fact that the photos didn't print in the hard copy of the impact statement is this kind of a minor issue in the grand scheme of things, but it is noteworthy. I do want to bring your attention, I guess I am going to bring it up. I do want to bring your attention to a statement that's made in the middle of page 11, where it says the geocube structure at 401 Cranberry Hole Road has had no noticeable repairs since construction, and sand maintenance fronting the structure is absent. I think it's safe to say that that statement is demonstrably false. So let me show you what that revetment looked like in 2017. When the first time I visited the Curtis property in the context of the application, this is what's the road. Oh, come on now. Am I not in Zoom meeting right now?
You're
Excuse
not.
me, Brian. Yes, you've lost the Zoom connectivity.
Thank you. I'm sorry about this.
Sure, it's not your fault.
I don't know if it's anybody's fault, but I am sorry about it. It's, you know, as Andy said, these applications are difficult. Nobody wants to see anybody lose their home, but there is also a management obligation, and you know, we'll talk about the obligations of the owner. You know, a certain level of responsibility a little bit later. Almost there. So this is Sirota in 2017. It's pretty apparent that structure was replaced in its entirety around the time, most likely at the same time that Curtis was installed. So the statement that it has suffered no noticeable repairs is pretty obviously incorrect.
Are there any visual impacts to structures like this? Because
Well, that's in, you know, I think it's obvious it is.
Number 8 is there will be little to no visual impacts of the seawall.
Well, I'm gonna go off script here and tell you a little bit. You can't have it both ways. You can't say that this is a structure that we can keep benign in the shoreline. We can keep it covered with sand, but yet the erosion is so severe here and it's getting attacked here all the time that we're going to lose our house if we don't have a hard structure here. You can't have a foot in both courts. Either the erosion is episodic enough to be manageable in the interim with sand and vegetation to make the erosion control structure kind of the last line of defense, or the erosion is chronic and severe enough that it's maintenance as shore neutral is going to be difficult to sustain. So yeah, this is obviously going to have visual impacts. There are other. I have a lot of images to show. I hope I can get the computer to cooperate or maintain cooperation. But one of the photos I have is a oblique aerial image of all of the properties on Cranberry Hole Road. Let's be clear: the only legal erosion control structure on Cranberry Hole Road is, I believe the address is 369. It's the Nagler property. It's a concrete seawall that predates zoning. I'm familiar with that property. I've reviewed applications on it in the past. All of the GeoCube revetments exist beyond their town authorizations. I don't know if Sirota and Golden have gotten extensions of their DEC permits. If they haven't, they're beyond their DEC authorizations. It's pretty clear that there's really been no effort on any of them to maintain the conditions of the DEC, to adhere to the conditions of the DEC permit. They've been exposed. You can see them from the water. You can see them from overhead aerials. You can see them from an oblique angular view. Big white square sandbags on the beach.
Is this is an example before us now? Is there any evidence of scour on either side of this thing that has occurred?
There was evidence of scour at the Curtis.
Right. So
that meant from day one.
For us, that's important.
I shouldn't say day one. Early on. Let me.
I think in the document that.
As I said, I've been there a number of times. I've taken photographs at a number of times, most frequently in 2018 and 2020. I'll show you some of them tonight. Not as many as I would have liked to have. Oh goodness.
Can I just say something while you're at this, Brian? Before you move on, you had a photo up there of 401, and we saw the condition of the sandbag. And one of the things that's going to be of interest, and Amy will have an opportunity to comment, is what is the lifespan of the bags? That seemed to indicate that there is a diminished lifespan once they're exposed. In the document that Andy produced, he said that properly maintained, they could last 30 years. There's another reference earlier on by, I believe, the planners saying that the maximum lifespan on these are 5 years. Those ones at 401 were there for how long before they were being replaced? Do we have an idea of what that was? What was the lifespan of those ones we just saw at 401 who needed replacement?
If I'm not mistaken, that the revetment or seawall at 401 was installed in either 2011 or 2012.
So within 6 years, there was some serious amount of work having to be done on those, largely because we're assuming they were exposed and therefore they took a certain amount of deterioration. There are some just a discrepancy on both sides. And again, Andy will have an opportunity to comment on this, but I do think it's important for us to know what we're looking at in terms of what the real viability leads in any length of time, especially when they're exposed, which they seem to take quite a beating once they are.
Member Galini asked about scour, and this is the Curtis property here. This is 401. This is Sirota. This is Golden. This is Nagler. All 4 erosion control structures have shown signs of scour. The fact that the impact statement, we'll come to that shortly. Again, I'm jumping around a little bit, says there's no scour evident. Scour has been evident right from the start. The scour is most severe on Sirota, probably because it's the oldest structure here. But scour was evident at the Curtis property as early as 2018. And scour is evident at the Nagler seawall on either side of it. I've been there. I've been to the property. Golden is the most recent that's exposed, so you want to make an argument that there's no scour yet. That's, I suppose that's a fair comment. But again, this, to my knowledge, this structure only became exposed in 2020. In the impact statement, they talk about maintaining sand cover. They talk about 135 cubic yards per year. They talk about, there's a little bit of detail later in the document about maybe an initial volume of 650 and then diminishing. But what there's lacking is any detail of how you're going to get it there, what it's going to look like, what its elevation is going to be, what its slope is going to be, where the toe of it is going to be. And that level of detail belongs in any natural resources special permit, but especially in an environmental impact statement where the level of analysis is really supposed to go to a higher level, to a greater level of detail, because you have already found as a board that this action has the potential to have significant environmental, adverse environmental impacts. You asked the applicant for a documentation or change in the surrounding parcels as a result of the current erosion control device and a qualitative and quantitative assessment of any active or passive erosion, wave reflection, scour, or flank erosion. And their response is that in September 2019, the dune was functioning and designed and appeared vibrant. This is what it looked like in as early as 2018. Remember, we had our hearing in July of 2018. I told you at the hearing that the structure was never going to look better than it did the night of the hearing. It was finished. It was planted in June of 2018. Summer is generally our most placid time with the fewest amount of storms. That's the growing season of beach grass. But by November 2018, the sandbags under the stairs were the first to be exposed. Remember, there was a row of sand fencing that spanned the width of the project, and that has washed away as a result of storm action, and the toe of the sand cover has already eroded.
And this is also 2018, September?
November. Yeah, I have a thing on top here. Otherwise, I could tell you that. I'll tell you the date right now. This was November 19th, 2018. I would respectfully argue that this is not functioning as designed and vibrant. Page 18, although the geocube structure was exposed spring in 2020, no apparent impacts to adjacent property owners have been recorded. No scour is occurring at the ends of the presently exposed structure, and wave afflection does not occur under normal wave conditions. I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree. Again, there's qualitative deficiencies in this document. There are quantitative ones. But one of the things we've asked the applicant to provide is what have been your monitoring efforts? What have you done to keep an eye on this thing? And again, that's information that hasn't been provided. I can't necessarily tell you all the dates that I've been there since this thing was installed. There were times that I went there and it looked the same as the last time I was there, and I didn't take photos, but we have a number of dates where, you know, you can see what happened in the exposure of the structure. And what happened is that the sand cover has eroded generally from west to east, if you take a look over time. Even though the sediment starvation that Mark Burns talks about in his report is from east to west, and the erosion seems to be more severe in the east than the west, the exposure of this structure and the sand cover is going from west to east, which really suggests more it's the direction of the storm than it's the starvation of the littoral process. But that's the type of thoughtful analysis that should be in the document and is not. Again, they say the documentation and accounting of monitoring was requested here. Their reply is the analysis is contained within the body of the document. When they were asked to assess the impacts to terrestrial and aquatic ecology under the section of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, all it says is none have been identified in this document. We discussed this at the hearing. At the very least, they should have at least repeated what is known. This is part of the Peconic Estuary Critical Environmental Area. This is whether you want to call it Gardner Bay or Napeague Bay shoreline. This is an area of productive littoral zone. If you think that you can introduce a foreign structure into this area and have no impact on these resources, I just can't see the connection there. So there is neither an articulation of what the natural resources are in this area, how it's used by marine resources and coastal species, or how they've been affected by the existing structure. I'm going to skip over some of the LWRP stuff that's actually in the impact statement because we have discussed this. One thing I do want to address is what Andy opened with when Andy, mentioned the duration of ownership and how that doesn't matter. And I respectfully argue that it doesn't. I think that I think it has to be said that much of the erosion that has occurred on this property occurred before the Curtises purchased it. One of your variance standards is the variance self-created? The Curtises certainly didn't create the erosion that is affected the area, but property owners do have a certain amount of obligation to perform a certain level of due diligence as to what not only the conditions are on a property that they're buying. And, Mr. Curtis was pretty candid at the hearing. He said they saw a piece of property, they fell in love, and they bought it, and that's fine. But this is a town with regulations for coastal management. This is a town that requires non-structural restoration activities before a hard structure is eligible for consideration. And it does appear that the applicants were unaware of maybe the erosion history of the property before they purchased it, and what the town regulations are. And that does contribute to the status of a self-created hardship. And again, they seem like nice people. I swear I hate these as much as Andy do. Probably more, because I got to be anyway. There's we already touched on the alternatives. I think that's enough of the actual impact statement. been up here longer than Andy was. There are members of the public that want to speak. I do want to address the June 21st submissions, but I don't want to be up here all night. I do think that Andy's criticism of the LWRP is a little unfair and misplaced. I don't know that this area was, remember, a lot of that text was written in the early 90s. And I don't know that this area, to my knowledge, was not identified as an erosional hotspot at that time. So, you know, applying that type of hindsight and that finger wagging at the document, I think is inappropriate. This area is an area that is accurately characterized as 7,000 linear feet of predominantly an area that's predominantly free of erosion control structures. I believe that measurement goes from Devon Yacht Club to the fish factory. I could double check that if you want. That's the distance of the 7,000 feet. And the only legal erosion control structure in that area is the very limited one at the Nagler property. If you want the linear footage of that, we can, you know, that's obviously pretty easy to provide. Andy told you that Curtis did what he was asked to do. I'm going to respectfully disagree with that because part of doing what you were asked to do is removing the structure at the end of the terms of the permit. That was that was nearly 3 years ago. Their DEC permit will expire in January of 22. That structure was expired by the time the town even had its initial hearing on the structure, where Andy and Aram said, give us 5 years to not get an erosion control district, but to build them. And here we are, kind of changing the terms a bit, more than a bit. Would you like me to continue with the document from the 21st, or do you want me to yield the floor to either, maybe Andy wants to address some of this?
Sure.
Or you want to give it up to members of the public?
And then maybe, and we also do have the continuation where we can pick up on August 10th.
However you want to proceed. I'd rather give myself the hook before you do.
Sounds good. Maybe we'll, Andy, if you don't mind, I think we'll. Yeah. Thank you, Brian, for all your work. Appreciate it. Is anyone here who would like to speak? Anything? Sure. Go ahead. Good evening, Joe.
Good evening.
You can introduce yourself for the record.
Yeah, Joe Karpinski, 14 Bayview Avenue. I swear to tell the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth.
Does that work, counsel?
Yes, that's fine.
Sounds good. Good evening,
Thank you.
Joe.
Good evening. I'd just like to address a few things, just to remind you when it comes to cubes. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, we got to get this road open back on June 4th, 2019. Just want to let you guys know Bayview's still blocked today. Obviously, that's First Coastal's cubes. Here tonight, we're talking about First Coastal's cubes as well. And when we talk about temporary, I don't know why we keep saying all these different years as temporary. Temporary is anything under 1 year. That's when the town gives a permit. It's 6 months with a chance to have 3 months continued. So this structure might have been granted a 5-year permit or looked at for 5 years. That's typically what the DEC will do, but they have their provisions to look over everything. Every 30 days that it's exposed, in that 30-day period, you're supposed to recover them. When you don't do that, it's supposed to be immediate removal. One of the things for alternatives, just to mention it, I know I had mentioned it when you guys had talked about 153, when they were coming last June. With that one, I mentioned the Lolly Column, sonotube piers, and possibly raise it up 12 feet since it's that close to be FEMA compliant. Just so you guys do know, I did do the research for 401 and 375. 401 was granted their permit between 2011, expired in 2012. In February of 2017, the town did send a letter to remove those cubes. The question is whether those cubes were done by the company that it was first granted to, John Castillo Marine Corporation, or if, possibly in 2018, when the Curtis property was done, they obviously became brand new and white once again. So we wonder if First Coastal did the work there. First Coastal did do the work at 375. That was granted in February of 2013, and that expired in 2018. So you guys are aware. Moving forward with that, just so you know, when we talked about the sand, when they did the years and they talked about in front of the side of the fish factory. I would just say the last time that it was ever dredged there was 1979. That's the last time that the dredger came down from Maine. And they used to dredge on that side. Typically when it was actually in operation, they would do enough there to make sure that they could get the big boats in there. And I mean, to remember, there's probably a lot of things underwater. There used to be a 300-foot dock. On the other side, as you go around towards Cherry Point, you'd end up having probably the brickyard kiln is probably underneath water. Some of those functions, if you walk along the beach heading back towards, Bayview that way, you'll see one of the brickyard kilns still out there, which I tried to make a historical landmark. I don't know if that's ever going to happen. Obviously, it is in a state park, so we do have that. And before that, before these homes were actually built, and remember this home in question tonight with the Curtises, that was built in 1979, or they were granted their permit in 1979. Before that, that area was considered one of the best spots to get sandworms. I've asked my father, I've asked my in-laws, everybody's told me about yesteryear, the 50s and 60s until then. So it was in operation. When Mr. Hammer talks about the wall that's there at the fish factory, I will actually say that I think it's 401 and 375 are preventing the littoral drift, and they are affecting the Curtises the most. So now you have the third home to do it, and then you're going to end up having the next home that's in between 375 and 393. They're probably going to apply. I wonder what the next two homes are going to apply for. So I will say when it comes to those, we have to remember that geocubes typically accelerate erosion 50 years than what would happen naturally. I can certainly tell you, you can go down the Bayview and you can see it, and you can see both sides going in to both the East Hampton and State Land on the left side and go to the right side, and the U's are getting larger by the day. I would question when it comes to the structure at the Curtis property, I've never understood why he has two water spigots above it, and I've seen it shoot water before. The beach grass wouldn't need the water. But I do know with each of these areas that have geocubes, we typically have seen an uptick in mosquitoes. So with West Nile and Zika on the rise, and I certainly know because it was right at the edge of their driveway and I have to pass it multiple times a day, I stopped and I saw a mosquito squad. So I certainly know they're spraying for mosquitoes there. So each of these structures end up becoming a habitat. Happens down by me, happens here, that you're going to have a ponding of the water. So every time none of these, sorry.
No, you're right. I'm sorry.
Nope. So that ultimately becomes the issue with it. When it comes to the permits, I used to give Nigel Curtis at these meetings a lot of credit because he kept his defunct permit from the town there for a long time. None of these properties ever put their DEC permits out. And I just want to make a point that none of these places having a permit out is $250 a day. So if you do both of the expired properties, and say we assume back to the beginning, they've never put any permit there. One's at 9 years, one's at 8 years. That's in excess of $800,000 for one property, excess of $900,000 for the other, which both would end up going back to the town of East Hampton, and do that same amount would be going to the DEC for not having their permit at the property. So that's just a reminder with that, which actually brings up the bigger issue that we talked about, and Mr. Hammer alluded to, that the homeowners on Cranberry Hole are certainly interested in what do they do about the erosion. Now, certainly down by me, Mulford, going down towards Lazy Point, we wonder the same. So since we used to dredge, and we've had a big push for it now recently, because a lot of people are grouping together. Hopefully our side and Cranberry Hole can group together, and it comes back to dredging. And dredging is unfortunately expensive, but it's one of the ways to do it. A lot of it, I believe, leads back to the harbor and the fact that the one inlet that's open now is the inlet that possibly could be shut, or we have to maintain two inlets being open for the continuity of the sand to go back and forth. I would say the other part that we've never had before until you guys on May 11th, I heard that you were going to do it with the PEM project, was site remediation bonds. And typically that would be if any of these structures end up staying around too long, that we would end up having the means to pull them out of the ground when the homeowners decide they can just stay there as long as they want without going through any of the proper process, having permits that are defunct. So really the two properties on each side of Curtis, basically they could pay for the dredging of Nat Peak Harbor right now with their fines that they would have. That being said, I would say at the other side of the fish factory in the corner, you could think about the PEM project. I wonder if that might be a possible spot. So I would think somebody would want to reach out to Dr. Laska and put it down in that corner. I still think that even with the one over there from Mr. Anderson, if it does come to fruition, I still think the best possible answer would be the three caveats I did say back in the February meeting, which would be to dredge Nat Peak, get rid of the groin, because that is the structure there that's holding up, put the sand in front, and then put that PEM project out in the water to give them the best possible chance to succeed. But those are just a couple of the things. So no matter where these structures are, they can't be withstand unless the only goal is to just protect the properties and to rid us of beaches forever. You see it every year out in Montauk. What happens? We have to dump sand continuously every year. And I wonder if that permit's the same with the DEC. Is that every 30 days it's exposed? Are they supposed to be putting sand back over? So how many permits are just deficient? So it just brings to the light that we do have the issue. It's coming forward. And I give the Curtis's credit for coming forward and actually bringing their whole DEIS forward to you tonight. And the next meeting, fortunately, I don't think I'll be able to be at the next meeting. That's why I wanted to make sure I was here tonight. So ultimately, that's what it is. I hate to say it, but they all have to go. They're all defunct, and none of them should be. Thank you.
Well, Joe, thank you for coming out tonight. We appreciate your comments. Kevin?
Good evening, Kevin. Good evening, Chair, members of the board. My name is Kevin McAllister. I'm founder and president of Defend H2O. We're a clean water and coastal advocacy organization.
I'll swear you in quickly, Kevin. You swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do. Thank you. Thank you for receiving my comments this evening. The board may recall I was present at the July 17th, 2018 public hearing. Brian suggested maybe revisiting the tape. I would encourage you to do so. I'll limit my comments to the draft EIS this evening, augment perhaps some of the comments that were made earlier, but I think relative to understanding coastal processes in the larger context of this issue, I think it behooves the board to take a look at some of that tape. I have reviewed the EIS, and I guess, well, before that I enter into that, let me just qualify myself. I hold an advanced degree in coastal zone management, which really the coursework was principally coastal processes. And the culmination of that is, I consider myself an expert on dune management, the dune management as an alternative approach to shoreline hardening. I worked roughly 10 years for Palm Beach County. Much of that was an environmental analyst in shoreline protection. So my role was principally the biology associated with shoreline management projects, beach nourishment, et cetera, and managing dunes. Having looked at the draft EIS, I guess, I wanted to call into question some of the deficiencies. And as staff has pointed out, I'll use the term procedural and technical deficiencies. There's not a lot of substance to the draft. In particular, terrestrial and aquatic ecology, that's not at all addressed. And Brian had cited the actual response in the document, but it's void. And, you have to consider, habitat, number one. This is part of the Peconic Estuary. We are talking about intertidal habitat, beach habitat, the near shore. There are living resources that need to be considered here. Human resources, and I'll have to call out, I guess, a real factual deficiency, or it's an erroneous statement, if I may read this. I mean, this really struck me. Human resources transportation on page 14. The erosion control devices has kept the beach intact, as noted previously. Removing the erosion control structure will result in further degradation of the beachfront and impede pedestrian access. I would vigorously argue that it's the contrary. In fact, over the long term, the presence and permanence of the structure will obliterate the sandy beach. The passage goes further that this is not a public beach. Well, not in the true sense of the word. I mean, it's not Indian Wells down the street, but we do have town property that allows for public access. And I'm a staunch proponent of the public trust doctrine. And, I would argue government in general just tends to ignore that, that New York common law that guarantees the right of passage and repassage. So ultimately the loss of, again, the fronting beach here as a result of a hardened structure will in fact incur significant damages to transportation, to public use of that area. Significant environmental impacts, once again, void. You asked a question on scour. I'd like to expand on Brian's very articulate description. Scour, of course, this occurs when there's real wave action. And, from the spring of 20, that's when significant changes occurred with a storm event. And now we've been in a period where it's more favorable. So we do have a winter summer cycle, even on a bay environment, where there's accretion on a bay beach, and the same, and then erosion forces when there's energy. It all equates to energy. So the fact that we're suggesting there are no significant impacts, absolutely. So it's just a matter of time before we see the real influence of the structure and scour in front as well as end scour. Some of the photographs certainly depict it. So again, as we enter into the winter season, and knock on wood, there's no further significant erosive forces jeopardizing the shore frontier, but unquestionably scour will occur, and that's just a fact with these structures. End scour, you see the pictures. The alternatives, non-structural approaches. There's no substance to an examination of alternatives. And I was present in July hearing that, we're moving into exploring an erosion control district. So, ultimately sand management. Okay, well, that is in fact the answer here, but it hasn't happened. And again, with respect to the DEIS, it doesn't go there. It's almost as though this is the representation is that this is a permanence, and there's no need to discuss these issues that are important. And as Brian articulated, the substance in an EIS, it has to go deep technically here, and it just doesn't go there. Non-compliance, and I guess this is really lastly in hearing and in full candor, you perhaps know my stance on structures. I think long-term, it's a death knell for our estuary. And, relative to the LWRP, in fact, again, back in 17, I think, the July 17th, 2018, I made a representation. I was very involved in the development of the LWRP. I applauded its pragmatic approach relative to different zones and what you can do. The pragmatic approach here relative to code is allowing protection in a temporary basis. And that's what the geotextiles, a 6-month duration with a 3-month extension. And, this is Groundhog Day. We're continuing to talk about this, and now it's in a context that this is a permanent structure. And I think if we go down that road, there's no stopping it. And what was not factored in the development of the LWRP, and here's someone that is schooled in this subject, clearly paying close attention to climate change and changes, sea level rise. We had no concept or no real understanding of the acceleration. And I can tell you as a guy of the bush and bay, I've been paying attention to it for years. And the changes over the last 10 years, it's really starting to ramp up. 10 years before that, it was negligible. Oh wow, there's the tide's a little higher this month. Now we get it. And in the old adage, we ain't seen nothing yet. And certainly with the projections that have been put forth by New York State, adopted in environmental conservation law, going out 11 to 30 inches, which now they say is a very conservative values, going back into the 2050s. So we are ramping up. There's going to be serious changes. I'd just like to conclude by saying, as someone, again, trained in this area, I'm very impressed with the staff analysis. Brian really knows his stuff. He has articulated to you very deeply. I won't take up your time this evening, but I concur. And, you know, let's really stick to what is principally the fundamental intent here is to protect, you know, the public resources. And that requires some really hard choices and difficult choices for boards such as yours. So again, I looking at the draft EIS, I would say it's grossly deficient across the board. It's erroneous. If this is what, you know, they intend to serve up as final product, then assess it and make your decision based on that. But again, bear in mind, again, I think the intent of LWRP and town code. So thank you very much for hearing my comments this evening.
Thank you for coming out, Kevin. We appreciate your comments, and feel free to come back at the next
I
hearing.
will. I intend to. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Andy, do you want to wait till the next hearing or any comments?
Good afternoon, Andy Hammer. I don't have a lot to add. Just so the board knows, I was going to be on vacation for the 10th. So that, you know, that's kind of why we have a two-step here.
Right.
You know, I've heard you. I've heard Brian's analysis. Seeker is not about pointing to specific deficiencies. It's about providing you with enough information to take a hard look and make an informed decision. You know, I will reach out to some of the other people that are involved in this. Keep in mind, I can't catch darts for everybody. I'm not Dr. Burns. I'm not the contractor who installed this project, which actually is not working with Mr. Curtis right now. So there's a lot of information that I just don't have. I wasn't there when they installed the structure. I wasn't there when the original permits were sought. You know, I'm going to try and get somebody who was to actually answer. You know, clearly I'm handicapped a little bit by Nigel not being here. I'm sure you would have some of that information base, but I'm going to require him to watch this hearing and respond accordingly. You know, I think Kevin said it best. You know, you have a lot of choices, but it's not just choices, it's balancing as well. That's what this board does, is it makes choices based on informed decisions and balances the equities under the variance standards. You know, I didn't think I was going to come here tonight and have Kevin and Brian suddenly be proponents of shoreline hardening structures. That just wasn't going to happen, and it's not in the cards. I don't think, no matter how much we talked about it, they would ever be in favor of that. However, there are certain times when the balance of equities requires that the board look beyond the presumed impacts to see, is there a way that we can mitigate them for the moving forward. Other than that, I've been taking notes. I'm going to watch the hearing again tomorrow, send it to the informed parties, and hopefully we'll have some additional, information that they can submit to you. Other than that, any other questions, I'm available if you have any.
Just a comment on that this has been a long, drawn-out process, and to be here today and saying that we're going back and seeing if there's more information when there's been plenty of opportunity to get that information doesn't sit well. So, there you go.
And I totally understand. However, I'm not the engineer. I'm not the one who projects loss to replenishment. So, the specifics of that.
There's been ample opportunity.
Yeah. So the specifics of that are perhaps what can be addressed. And I'm just not in a place where I can address them for you right now.
Yeah, I would also like more in-depth information. We talked about the erosion control district. You stated in 2018 that the erosion control district and that there was the neighbors were in overwhelming support of going forward with that, and that you had some preliminary documents to go to town board. Yet tonight, you only mentioned that there was a memo sent to the supervisor. I'd love to know what transpired in the last 3 years.
And hopefully I can get that from Nigel Curtis, other than the fact that we've had a pandemic for 18 of those months. Everything's a little different, but I do know there were a lot of vibrant community meetings. I wasn't present at them. Dr. Burns had prepared a document. They were reviewing it, and perhaps he can provide more color in terms of what actually has transpired in the last 3 years since the last time we were here.
Okay, thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
So council,
Just to note that we'll pick this up again on August
August 10th.
10th.
Great.
at 6:30. Yep.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it. Brian, I'm sorry, did you have another comment you wanted to make? Go ahead.
I'm gonna, excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it wouldn't be best to just address the deficiencies in July 21st submission from Andy now, rather than have new information come in 2 weeks and then another requested opportunity to address it.
Yeah.
This has gone on for a pretty long time. And if
Why don't you lay
you'll
them
humor me, I'd rather just kind of lay it out.
Yeah.
Well, part of it, we talk about, the purported disparity of how the Curtis property has been treated, and that's in the second page of Andy's memo. And I just want to summarize: the Curtises are going through the natural resource special permit process. That application is being reviewed on its merits. If the other properties do the same thing and they're treated differently, that's arbitrary and capricious. But to say that they're being treated differently is inaccurate. There's a reference to, I've addressed the LWRP. There's more information in this July 21st submission about the status of the erosion control district efforts than there was in the impact statement. So, Member Berger, you really touched on that already. I'll skip over that. Pardon me. On page 6, there's a comment about the 10 extra geocubes. I'm not going to try to bring up the aerials anymore, but we know that there are at least 10 extra geocubes. You don't need to get somebody on site to stick a sand probe behind the first row of sandbags. And if you hit plastic a foot down, or use a garden trowel, and it's not going to be hard to figure out whether there are 2 rows or 1 row of sandbag there. You don't need an X-ray machine. It's not rocket science. It's sand, and a sand probe goes right into sand. And we'll tell you very quickly. I suspect there is, because there is on the other properties which had a similar permit design submitted for them. 1 row of sandbags. Over time, with overwash, it was apparent that there was a 2nd row of sandbags on Bayview Avenue. And I believe the same is true because of its exposure at the Sirota property. It is reasonable to suspect that there's a chance that Curtis was built the same way. And again, you don't even have, if that's the case, you don't even have accurate plans for what you're trying to assess in this project. One of the statements I found the most galling is on page 7, where they do talk about the removal plan. In the impact statement, we already discussed the fact that they said there is no removal plan, and I applaud them for trying to make an effort to address it. But where it says the removal process is simply cutting open the geocube bags and lifting them away by skid steer for disposal offsite, allowing the sand inside to empty onto the beach bluff and remain there, followed by a hand grading to uniform shape. That can't possibly be a complete removal plan. Remember, you're at least 1 row of the geocubes are below grade. The lowest elevation of the geocubes are below grade. They each weigh anywhere from 1,500 to 1,700 pounds. You're not going to just cut them open and spread the sand out and call it a day.
And you can't lift them out either. You'd have to excavate and cut them.
Well, there has to be more involved in the removal plan, and that statement is just so inadequate it almost encapsulates how shallow the assessment of this really is.
I have a question about the sand in the geocubes. Is that high quality beach sand?
We don't know. I can't answer that. But that's some of the most basic things to again, it's one thing to not be on the same page, but I don't know that we're even in the same book in terms of how this, how the structure is being assessed. To suggest that, I touched on a lot of the code standards in the environmental assessment. I'm not going to do that again now. But one standard that was addressed by Andy was the buffering and screening. The buffering is its proximity to the neighboring property to the west. There is no buffering to the adjacent property to the west. This structure goes from lot line to lot line, or just about. So any flank scour, any end scour at the western end must occur on the neighboring property. And that's, contrary to the management of any erosion control structure. Again, there's a statement in here that there will be little to no visual impact from the seawall, presuming that it's going to be covered and stay covered. The other thing to remember with a structure like this, even with the vegetation, is a lot of, that vegetation is really more cosmetic than substantive. I'd encourage any of you to go to an ocean beach in December after we've had a couple of storms and the dune erodes a little bit. You know how deep beach grass grows? You know how deep those roots go? And when a foredune gets a little bit eroded and exposed, you can see it. You can see the network of roots. They go down several feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, are not uncommon. The older the grass is, the deeper the deeper the root systems are. You know how grass grows; it spreads out horizontally and comes up again in new shoots. You can't do that when you're hitting a plastic bag. So the beach grass that's covering this stuff really isn't providing the true benefit that it does in nature.
Is it typically part of the DEC permit is also covering 12 inch on Central American beach grass typically?
Well, the planting of the vegetation and, if it helps keep the sand there a little bit longer, maybe there's some merit to it, but all of that really becomes moot if you're really not going to ever maintain that sand cover. And that's what we're not talking about gaps in the coverage. We're talking about a complete lack of coverage. And I think those are the more, there are other issues with the code standards. The comparison to the downtown Montauk project is really out of place. The downtown Montauk project is a collaboration of federal, state, county, and town. And the town has gone through great lengths, efforts, and expense to honor their terms of the contract and to try to keep those geotextile bags downtown covered with sand before the summer comes. And I think if you're gonna compare it. Again, we're talking about multiple properties over 3,100 feet in a downtown area, a project that involves the federal government, the state of New York, Suffolk County, and the town of Hampton, compared to a single family residential property here. And it's beyond apples and oranges. I don't know if it's too late to take a hard, honest look at the various factors we discussed here tonight, and we discussed back in 2018. But I think that's without that information, I think it's almost impossible for you to make any finding that this that this is going to be eligible for a natural resources special permit and variance. And I take no pleasure in saying that. I don't want to see anybody suffer any damage to their property, and certainly not their homes. But this is, time has borne out that this is not a sustainable, a manageable solution to the problem here. I'll end with that.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that.
Brian, don't go far. You're going to be next on the agenda. We're going to live here.
Okay, so we will continue this hearing August 10th, 2021. And again, thank you all for coming out for your comments and participation. We appreciate that.
Chair, if we can make a slight change to the agenda and
Oh,
move
yes.
on our other decisions, we do have an extension of time that involves Brian and perhaps to use his time more wisely here. Maybe we can
Yes.
move that up out of order.
That sounds fine. That sounds fine with me. Nancy, Brian has a long drive.
Shorter at this time of day than any other time. My gosh, it's not so bad.
I will go ahead. Thank you, Brian. I will go ahead and read this in. This is an extension of time board minutes that we had tabled. This is a Jello at 19 Fenwick Road in Montauk. That's about 300-19-8-22.1. And Brian, would you mind giving it to the public as well, giving a little summary of the history of the summer complex extension of time?
Yeah, I don't mind. So hoping to do visual aids.
Yeah, you're not connected.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
Is there any kind of plug-in data connection that ever would work?
No, it's
Excuse me,
a matter of which
everybody.
Wi-Fi.
Excuse me, this is Mike. Brian, I'm connecting you right now.
Oh, good. Thank you,
Connected.
Michael.
Thank you, voice for real.
Yeah. Like the Wizard of Oz, but Michael, we are not blaming you for data connections whatsoever.
No.
And
No, I think it's the internet.
Wi-Fi issue. Yeah, it's an internet issue.
No, it's nothing with LTV.
Yeah.
It happens. There are connection issues, and when you get dependent on technology, sometimes it bites you, and that's kind of what's happened to me tonight. And I apologize.
Not narrow space.
Yeah, I have to. Doggone it! I really want to get over to the right folder. Let's see if I can walk and shoot down at the same time by telling you that the Agello matter involves two separate zoning board decisions. The properties are side by side, or really back to back. One fronts on Fenwick, and the other fronts on Fairview. The Fairview property was improved with residential improvements. The Fenwick property was vacant when it came to the zoning board in 2007. And in 2007, there was an approval issue for a single-family residence and sanitary system. In 2015, the Fairview property had built some structures without building permits that were too close to the shared property line with the Fenwick lot. And their proposal to remedy that was to merge the two properties, which would eliminate that side yard nonconformity. And instead of a residence on the Fenwick property, it would have a garage and a pool house. To my knowledge, that permit has not been extended. That would have expired. What's physically on the property right now is a driveway and what appears to be a pool house. That pool house is not in the same location as the pool house that was approved in 2015. The extension of time request that the board was asked to consider was the 2007 request to maintain a valid permit for a new residence and septic system. So you've got a request to keep a permit valid to build a house on a lot that has an accessory structure that doesn't appear to have corresponding permits. And I think it's incumbent upon.
Just to be clear, we don't have a building permit for that. It appears it was built without a building permit for the pool house.
That's correct, and it doesn't match the location where a building permit, where a pool house was approved on paper. So what it appears is that you have an applicant seeking to keep a valid permit for a single and separate lot while using the property as an adjunct to their existing lot on Fairview. And I think by the time I get this thing going, it's gonna be done. But
Doesn't the latter, that was my question, doesn't the latter approval void the first approval? How can there be two approvals?
They're on different tax map numbers.
Because the merger never actually happened.
Merger never actually happened. So the approval in 2007 was with regards to 19 Fenwick, and the approval in 2015 was the Fairview. So they aren't, but because they are under current ownership and there's inconsistencies, it is fair for this board to ask the owner the applicant, which is his intent, because he made representations to the board in the 2015 that he was not pursuing 2007. So if he needs to give this board some information as to whether they can rely on statements made in 2015. If not, then he certainly cannot have the benefit of that, what was granted there, and has to put Fairview back into compliance.
Right, so now there's a nonconformity.
Then there's a nonconformity for both properties, right?
Both spots.
Yes, so we need to know what is his intent, because he has given,
So
one would think that the 2015 was the superseding intent, but now by attempting to extend 2007, that's contradictory.
So Terry, let me make a
So we want to
suggestion.
know his
Terry.
intent.
Yeah, so I'd like to make a suggestion that this board request that our council draft a letter to the Agello family, Mr. Agello, whoever it is, and give them a 2-week deadline to correspond with this board within 2 weeks on their intent, and be specific exactly what they are referring to, so that the planning department and this board can deal with it appropriately. I'm sure down the road, the next step, I'm sure I'm going to want to see, no matter what happens, eventually surveys, and we have to get proper permits, and this is not going to be a simple issue, but I feel that would be the best first step, and I believe council agrees with me on that. And Brian, we've discussed it with Brian, that we draft. This board, we've gotten into the habit of that. When these extensions of time come up and there's a lot of difficulty, we kind of give the applicant one shot at clarifying the intent here. So
Otherwise, we can ask them to remove or rectify the nonconformities.
Well, that's the thing, is we need to know
Which
which
one?
nonconformity that we're looking to
and
get
there's
them in
several.
compliance.
There's a pool house without a building permit, and there's setbacks that are not.
Well, he's
Being addressed
he's
by
done kind of a
non-merging
mix and
lots.
match of two
Yeah,
approvals.
Right,
All right, I'm willing to say, 2 weeks to tell us which one. And then
then we take
subsequently, as you mentioned, surveys and
well,
A
once we know which
comparison of-
one,
what was
Then
done
we
on
discuss
each
that.
property.
when we know which one,
Yeah.
then if it is going to be for the one that is before us for an extension of time,
Which is only fair.
then what would need to get into compliance in order to be eligible for that extension of time. If in fact, under the circumstances, they would want to do Fairview, then that would be the one that they would need to bring forward to us for an extension of time and get that one into compliance.
But so
Okay,
supposedly it
but for
comes
what-
back and says to us a 2007 one. Then there's a nonconformity of having an accessory building without a principal building.
Right, and so it's not in, it's.
How do we have an extension of?
Well, I think we have to
allow
take
an
it-
Extension of time with that.
I'm not saying we do. I think we have to take this one
Yeah.
step at a
Yeah.
time.
We have to know.
I don't think this is going to be an
To
easy
know what the
extension of
current
time.
status
Yeah,
is.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
we can't give an extension of time when there's all these.
And then Brian, the extension of time is for Fenwick,
Which is
and
the
it-
2007.
2007. 2000, on Fairview, they've never come in for an
Not that I'm aware of. I can't say with definitively, but I'm not aware of an extension of time for that 2015 permit. And in theory, in 2016, somebody, we could have said, gee, I really need to sell this lot. So I'm not going to proceed with my 2015 permit, and I'm going to remove the structures that are near the property line, or come back for ask the board for a variance from them.
Right.
And I'm going to, go forward that way. But
Yeah, but
Right
then
now,
2015, they've got all the.
it is mix and match right now. So
That would have.
Yeah.
No longer needed.
So we obviously, in order to give them guidance of what the board is looking for to get into compliance
I agree.
with one or the other,
Okay,
but
so
one
pick one,
or the other,
pick one.
not one.
we'll
and
go
the other.
from there. Pick one and we'll
Pick
go
one.
from there.
Right,
Okay.
we just need.
For 2 weeks, I don't.
No, 2 weeks, and then at that point, we'll have.
We'll
some
discuss
sense.
it, and then I'm sure, there's going to be another step, because, and I agree, Terry, we want to move this thing along when there are code enforcement issues and things like that. We want to move it along and not working months, but working weeks.
No, not months.
Yeah.
I went to both properties.
Yeah.
I find it hard to believe this actually happened. Why did it?
Well, when there are two tax map numbers, it can't
Well,
happen. And
Yeah,
that's,
but the 2015 had both on it.
yeah, So that could be.
So, council, thank you. If we could ask you to draft that letter, that
Certainly.
correspondence, we'd appreciate it.
Certainly will.
You wordsmith that, thank you. Okay, Brian, so we'll table this, and Brian, thanks for your time and have a safe drive home.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks anyway, so.
Did you have any other comments?
No, I didn't. I had, there was something else on your work session agenda. I was going to bring it up on the tablet and share the screen, but I'm gun shy right now for sure.
Well, if we need to, we'll use the hard copies.
Yeah, we do have the, but is that we're going to table the hunting, the board members, as board member Brenneman is absent, we're going to table the post-hearing decision for 212 Hunting Lane LLC. I don't know, Brian, we are going to discuss Gregory T. Cass and Marlin Drive. If it's easy to pick that up, pull that up. But we have our survey. I have the hard copy here. And
We have hard copies.
I have the file because we're back in person. Yeah, and we have it here. So we're good. Brian, safe drive. Have a good evening.
I can stick around for the discussion if you like.
I suggest you get home and get dinner. You got low drive.
Be home in a half hour.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Okay, thanks, board members. So going back to our agenda, we, again, we'll look at item 4, work session. B1, we'll table that. And that's it. Be on the agenda for next week. We'll have a full agenda next week. With decisions and with, I believe, 4 public hearings as well. So now we'll move to Gregory T. Cass at 1 Marlin Drive in Montauk, tax map number 300-131-2-1. Oh, it's not gets it. I know, we had this conversation, right? It's in my get certificate. It's on the folder.
But I think Ed did this one.
Ed did this for.
Oh,
Chad.
you did.
He did it for you.
Yeah,
That's
good.
where the
Oh, that's
confusion.
right. And you took it over. You were assisting me.
Yeah, they got you.
So good. So
I
I'm
know.
going to, I've read it in. So you know what, Ed, if you please, I'm going to take the lead on this one, if you would. I appreciate that.
Chairman, the board will remember that the hearing was held for Cass on February 18th, May 18th, 2021. The last updated survey we have is dated October 16th, 2020. It's located in the corner of Marlin Drive and Montauk Highway, this property, so it sits in the Amagansett section of the town. The relief short is for an NRSP and 2 variances for side and rear yard setbacks, one at 4.9 feet and one for 5 feet. The non-conforming lot, however, they qualify for 2/10 rule, which would reduce the setbacks needed from both of those locations. The house was constructed sometime after the building permit was issued in 1980. Most recent C of O was issued in 2014. The applicants are looking to demolish some existing decking and to add some additional decking to the east, south, and west. The existing shed is to be removed and the decking at the east will be set in its place. The deck to the south will be increased in size in 3 directions. An outdoor shower will be added to the south alongside the staircase. The property is set in the Montauk by the Sea subdivision, which is populated with small lots and is set in native dune land covered typically in beach vegetation. Given the sensitive nature of the site's natural environment, the board is asked to consider granting an NRSP to allow this work to proceed. The planning department made several recommendations concerning this project. While a revegetation plan was included in the applicant's original submission, the planners asked for a more detailed one to be produced that would include increasing the density of native beach grasses at the site. And they asked for small lawn to be removed and native plantings to be installed in its place. Subsequent to the hearing, the applicants contacted the planning department and agreed to those requests. They will work with Eleni Nicolopoulos on reaching an adequate planting plan and will remove the lawn and replace it with native plants. Given both the nature of and the amount of work that is to be done on this site and the confined nature of the house lot, coupled with the applicant's willingness to work with planners on a comprehensive planning plan, I'm looking forward to approving this application. In terms of the variance standards we have to consider, I find that the proposed improvements will not change the character of the neighborhood adversely. I also find that the area variance requested is not substantial, that given the restricted nature of the house lot and the benefit to the applicant cannot be achieved by some other method, that the revegetation plan should help to improve the natural condition of the lot, and that while the need for a variance is self-created, the efforts being offered by the applicant significantly help to mitigate the request, and that their request, and it does not preclude my willingness to approve the application. Therefore, Mr. Chair, I am happy to approve this application.
Thank you, Ed, for that thorough analysis. Appreciate that.
What's the date of the latest?
10/16, that's
16/20?
Yeah.
I have one if you need to
No, I
comment.
don't, I have that one.
Terry, comments, please?
Yeah, well, I'll start at the bottom line. I too am looking to approve this application. There was discussion about the revegetation plan, and I believe we received on May 13th. Is it for you?
That's before the
Yeah.
hearing.
Okay.
Oh, that was before.
the hearing?
Yeah,
Okay.
May
So
13th.
we did have a revegetation plan that we received on May 13th. And I believe there was a little additional work that was going to be done, as Member Johan said. And I did ask Eleni about that also. She said that they have agreed to removing some of the grasses and do further revegetation. But we do have the plan from that date prior to the final revegetation plan. We did have also one letter of support from a neighbor.
Neighbor, yes.
And not much else to say. I also believe it meets the standards for the variances, so we're looking to approve this application.
Thank you, Terry. Roy?
Yes, I agree with both members that have reported so far. I believe that the mitigation suggested is adequate for and to outweigh the requested variances.
Thank you, Roy. Again, I appreciate Ed's thorough summation of what this is all about. And I agree as well with all of the comments that have been made. It does, I'll add this, that the coverage, the proposed coverage does get us, the total coverage, let's see, is growing up to 48.9%, and 50 is the maximum. So, but I think this is somewhat of a unique, considering, it's on the corner of Marco Highway and Warland Drive. Got houses on all sides. The neighbors are not objecting. I think that the expanded deck becomes a play area for children that the applicant mentioned, and I think they are very willing and appear to be want to be good stewards of the structure with all the revegetation they're proposing. So I agree with my fellow board members in approving this application. Does that work for you, council?
That's enough for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, board members, let's see.
I think the next,
We have the minutes, I believe, is next. And I have read the minutes listed that Kyle has produced for June 22nd, July 15th, and July 20th. And can I get a motion to approve these minutes? A board member, please.
I have to confess.
That's all right. It's okay.
And it wasn't on
That's
the
right.
agenda that I have
That's
printed
fine, that's
from.
fine. Well, we'll put this off. They're all there on townclerk.com that we can pick up next week.
Yeah.
And Kyle, thank you for getting this pulled together. And there's no harm in putting that off for next week. Now we will move on to item 6, resolutions on the agenda. First, I'll start reading in. We have Deborah Pinsky at 30.
would you like the
Yes, please.
actual ones?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna give you,
Um,
hang on. Give me two in order so you don't get off. Yep. We have 2 rehearing determinations, we have 2 post-hearing determinations, and we have 2 extension of time.
Right. Thank you, Nancy, for all of your work on this. Appreciate that. I will go ahead and read the first one in here. This is in my district. So this is in the matter again of Deborah Kapinski, tax map number 300-174-4-11. This was a rehearing date, April 27th, 2021. And I'll just say this was a request to modify the determination dated October 1st, 2019, filed October 8th, 2019, approving the construction of a swimming pool with additional decking, as well as to allow existing decking, a stone walk, a wooden fence, propane tanks, a generator, and 296 square feet of clearing to remain on a parcel of land containing dune land and beach vegetation. And again, this is at 30 Devon Road, Narragansett. And the board members, the 4 of us that were here, myself, Roy Jolene, Teresa Berger, and Edward Johan, approved this modification. So I would like to make a motion to approve the resolution amending determination as written.
Second.
Concur.
I'll concur.
Thank you. Okay, next we have the board here, Gregory Buhay. And this is a resolution amending determination, and this is a rehearing from April 27th, 2021. And this was a request to modify determination dated November 17th, 2020, filed November 18th, 2020, approving the demolition of all existing structures and construction of a 2,421 square foot residence, 555 square feet of decking, 260 square feet of swimming pool, low nitrogen sanitary system, and driveway within the town's jurisdiction of wetlands. And again, we are at 15 Jackson Road in Montauk. And board member, let's see, it looks like all of us, it was the same meeting, Tim Randall was here, and we did approve this. So I would like to make a motion to approve the resolution amending determination for Gregory Buhay as written.
Second.
Concur.
I'll concur. Thank you.
Anything you take, doing them all, John?
Oh, no, those were both, oh, I'm sorry, that was not my.
Okay, you did it.
I
Go ahead,
apologize.
move on.
I gladly pass these on. The next one I will hear. This is Bonnie Maslin. This is in, Roy, this is in yours, correct?
Yes.
In Springs.
I
Vice Chair Delaney, you have it there?
Yep, and I read the,
What is,
so,
read that in, maybe.
Dr. Maslin, this request is pretty simple, application and in place in kind, replacement of a snow revetment. I read the resolution, and therefore I make a motion to accept the application, to approve the application as written. For Donnie Maslin, 307 Kingsmore Road, Springs, Suffolk, tax map number 300-024-01-11.
Second.
I'll concur. And I concur as well. Thank you, Roy. Okay, next. We have Gregory Cutillo. And this year is, Terry, would you like to take this
No,
one?
that's actually it.
Oh, that's it. I'm sorry. That's you, Ed. And then if you could read it, I'll just read this part. In the matter, this is a determination in the matter of the application of Gregory Cutillo at tax map number 300-19-7.1, and the physical address here is at 71 Gloucester Avenue in Montauk. If you would, Ed, thank you.
Thank you. Board, remember we discussed this, our decision was made last week. This was a request for variance for the fence and as well as an NRSP. We voted unanimously to approve this after some changes were made, and at that time we voted 5-0 to approve this as it was. So in the matter of Gerard Cutillo, Suffolk County Tax Map 300-19-7-1, I make a motion to accept as written the determination.
Concur.
And I concur. Thank you, Ed. Okay, now the last two are extensions of resolutions extending determination. The first is Laura Michaels at tax map number 300-28-4-27. And this is at 71 South Edgemere Street in Montauk. And which one of you Terry, there you go.
Thought you were gonna do it again, John.
I'm just reading it in, so it's all read officially.
So, as you all just heard, it's an extension of time for Laura Michaels, which was originally approved in 2009. But in the application of Laura Michaels, a tax map 300-028-04-27 at 71 South Edgeworth Street in Montauk. Make a motion to approve this extension of time.
I second it.
Concur.
And I concur as well. Thank you, Terry.
South Edgeworth Street?
South Edgemere
It says
Street.
south. It's really
Yeah.
south. Never noticed that on the sign.
Okay, the final one is in my applicant's district. This is a resolution extending determination on the matter of the application of John Senior at tax number 300-152-1-10. And this is going back to a determination the determination expiration was March 20th, 2021. This is at 200 Cranberry Hole Road in Amagansett, and the applicant has not constructed the house and wishes to extend his determination. So with regard to that, I would like to make a motion and to approve the resolution extending determination for John Senior at 200 Cranberry Hole Road in Amagansett.
I'll second it.
Concur.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's see, what we have, I think that may be, next we have, I think we're, council,
I
anything
think
else on your
that's
end?
everything, but we do need to be prepared to stay a little later next week.
Next
We will
week.
have a
Colin,
very
so
full
you're
agenda.
I saw that.
Right?
Hmm?
What is four?
We have 4 hearings and we have 3 determinations, post-hearing determinations.
Just get them.
Drink a couple of lattes before you get here. Okay, Nancy Lynn, thanks for all your work on that stuff. Thank
No
you,
problem.
board members, Kyle, LTV, Michael. Have a good evening, my vice chairman. Ask for a motion if you would, Ron.
For Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to close the public hearing of the Town of East Hampton Zoning Board of Appeals for Tuesday, July 27th at 8:31 PM.
Second.
I'll concur. And I concur as well. Thank you all. Have a good evening.